continuing our discussion of world food and world hunger. I wonder, Dr. Borlaug, if I may begin by asking a question that our viewers have had, and that involves any interest that's been shown in your program by either Russia or Red China.
Betty Lou, this past summer, I was in Russia as a guest of the Russian Academy of Science, and I traveled looking at their wheat research and production problems. And before leaving, I was asked whether we would accept young Russian scientists at our international center for training. And of course we accept scientists from many countries of the world, and we have had increasing number from behind the Iron Curtain countries, but none from Russia in the last few years. This hasn't come to be yet, and I suppose it may take some time because of all of the bureaucracy of clearing these people and the fear of some of them not returning, but I think we can serve a very useful need. It so happens, Betty Lou, that you see, before World War II, back in the mid-30s, probably some of the, well, certainly the outstanding wheat scientist in the world at that time was Inai Vavilov, Russian, and he died in the Siberian prison camp, and with him, over a period of years, many of his whole school of scientists. And now there were only a few of these men who survived with good competence. They are men now of 75 or so. They're still on the firing line. The few of these are carrying the whole load. And during this whole period of Lysenko, there were no people trained in conventional genetics and plant breeding. So there's a big gap. And this is one of the things that holds back their whole agricultural development. Of course, there are many other things. Lack of fertilizers, certainly way up the top of the pile. But I have a feeling that through food, this is one of the best bonds with other countries of other ideologies. We can understand each other perfectly well at the scientific level, so long as we're dealing with these things that are basic to all human needs. Similarly, we've been working informally with Algeria in the last few months. We hope to be able to give them a hand in a little more formal way in the next 6 months, starting perhaps late summer. We have 3 Algerians with us at the present time.
Did the Russians ask for some of your Mexican?
Yes, they have quite a few. I think they've got a lot of them from India, and we've sent them much of our breeding material. I think that they need to develop the agronomy. They don't know how to grow these things, and here again
They have pretty good wheat varieties themselves, don't they?
Well, these kinds that stand bad conditions, the same kinds, the old land races, but when you start fertilizing such a thing, it's kind of like having a Model T Ford, or let's put it the other way around. It's like having a 1971 Cadillac, and you put in that old gasoline of how many octanes that we used to run the T on. It just doesn't work very good.
Aren't we headed back to that?
Well, maybe so.
Dr. Borlaug, I thought you made some rather interesting statements in your lecture this evening about the use of pesticides and fertilizers at this time. Would you care to elaborate on this a bit and tell us how you feel about restriction on the use of fertilizers and pesticides?
Well, I think in the case of fertilizers, I think it's pretty evident to anyone who sits back and thinks about this that you wouldn't have an agricultural economy or prosperous agriculture such as that in the USA had it not been for chemical fertilizer. The old way we did things pretty largely with the rotations of cereals and legumes up to a point was effective, but we would never have achieved the yields that we achieve on our best farms now without the use of the right kind, the right dosages of chemical fertilizers. And it also, of course, is reduced per unit cost of production. So, and then to make the situation, to bring it out as it relates to the rest of the world. Now, I think probably for a few years, if somebody just foolishly said, well, you can't use chemical fertilizer anymore, the U.S. would probably not starve to death immediately. put all of this land back in
Farmers
production.
should get rich.
Well, I'm not so sure. People would
That's what
have to
Earl
get.
Eddy's studies show.
If you'd scare them well enough in the cities, you see in the, we got what, 4.5% of the people on farms now, something in that order, less than 5 at least. Isn't that
Yes.
right, Dr. Heddy?
About 4%
All right.
of the workforce and about less than 5% of the people live
Okay.
on farms.
And you know a good share of those urbanites, especially in the large cities, they don't know where this food comes from. They think it comes from the supermarkets.
Of course, there's kind of a rule of thumb here you might use, how to make everybody better off. One, if we used somewhat less fertilizer in production, where less, demand is inelastic, a smaller amount sells for more, brings in a greater total revenue. That would increase farmers' income in the United States. Then we could ship more fertilizer to underdeveloped countries. People die early because of malnutrition. Their lifespan would increase. I say there might be an in-between spot here where you make everybody better off.
And help
But
us
just-
on our problem with polluting the environment at the same time.
Just think of trying to implement that kind of a practice. Wouldn't that be a lovely job to be placed in charge of this, unless
But
you were
actually,
an
it ought to be-
absolute dictator?
It should be easier to ration fertilizer than to try to ration land the way we're doing now. That's a very
Well-
complicated and inefficient way.
Well, let me take the other side of this picture, fertilizer in the hungry world. You affluent people here, well, you've got some alternatives still, but you see, in the hungry nations, they have none. That soil's worn out as far as plant nutrient availability is concerned. You can't change the yield measurably, no matter how you change the agronomic practice and how you change the variety and how you control the diseases, because the
Well, yes,
diseases
it's certainly
and
far
insects-
to their advantage. One, I say you can step up life expectancy by overcoming malnutrition. Even if you ran it up to the place where you endangered their health because of intake and chemicals and so on, you would still make them better off, you would still extend their life. And also, there's no easier way to substitute for land for them than fertilizer. I think if you analyze all this material you can get your hand on, it shows that about a ton of fertilizer substitutes for about 50 acres of land as typically cultivated world around. So I say there's, for an undeveloped country, everything may be
Makes sense.
fine.
But you see, also, everybody's concerned, much more so than I, about the use of chemical fertilizers in big quantities. You know, people are living longer today than ever before, despite all of these things.
Yeah,
I think
there are
there's
a few
a lot
other
of
factors involved.
yes, and I think that for anyone who starts pointing a finger at the use of chemical fertilizers at the levels that in the developing world that they can economically supply is just whistling in the dark. This is a financial
Nobody's
impossibility.
doing that.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. Some of my very best critics have been very vociferous in this, in scientific
About-
publications, that using these heavy doses of fertilizer, we must be contaminating all the rivers and this sort of thing, and it's ridiculous. I was
Well,
first an
nothing
ecologist.
is much more contaminated than biologically than the atmosphere in India. You can't go there and eat any fresh vegetables or drink any unboiled water with the organic fertilizer they use on fields. I would certainly feel that it's a little safer for everybody to use chemical
You
fertilizers.
see, I think that people now, the ecologists, many of the purists, I'm not talking about the average ecologist. And I started out as an ecologist, a forest ecologist, forestry and watershed management and wildlife management. And then I worked for a chemical research organization for a number of years, and I had.
Could I
was wo-
inject something here that I think is marvelous? Was that the organization that where you threatened to quit if they wouldn't allow you the freedom to use the laboratories at night and on holidays?
Yes, ma'am. This was during the war years.
Sidelight.
You see, you're looking at one of the first guys that had DDT up to his ears and arms, and when we knew very little about this. I'm still alive, and I'm still pretty mean. And I don't expect to die from DDT poisoning very soon. And I think that what's going on here is that a lot of people are calling wolf before there's very much evidence to show wolf. I'll admit that a long DDT type of pesticide, which is persistent and survives as such, the molecules do for a long period of time, can get into the food chains, and some of these birds that live especially off water.
You don't know what it'll do to the next generation of people either.
Oh, I think there's pretty good evidence about this. This is just a lot of silliness about the mutagenic effects that are going on, all sorts of things. It's very difficult to produce these kinds of changes. Too much has been said about this without any real good evidence. Not only in the case of DDT, but in many of the
Well,
other.
isn't that true on both sides? I mean, if you don't know, you don't know. Either way.
Anybody who's tried to provoke mutations wouldn't simplify to the point where these kinds of dosages that are being used is likely to produce monsters in the human species. I think this is ridiculous.
For your critics of an undeveloped country, I think they're looking at it only in a one-sided sense. And I think there's a set of trade-offs, maybe perhaps between chemical pollution and biological pollution. Maybe you have to find the right balance of the thing. I would still think for an undeveloped country, such as India, biological pollution without any chemicals is much more dangerous to mankind and everything else than chemical.
Different kinds of choices there than you do here.
I would disagree with you. I'm sorry, Mr. Soth. I just can't buy your negative point of view on use of chemical.
My point of view to me is positive.
Chemical fertilizers. Well, I say I'm talking for mankind. You people here are very privileged people indeed. And you can afford to have these kinds of points of view. But this very program will probably go halfway around the world, and it'll be used to say, you see what happens in the USA? And now you're advocating this kind of an approach for our country, but it's not good enough for the USA. This is psychologically ruinous to any program to try to help these people from the standpoint of solving their food problems.
Well, I would say that it would be foolish in India, for example, to go heavily into livestock because they can't afford to convert it, the grains as much as we can.
Right.
There's a difference between the two countries. And I think there's a difference in the policy that you take on use of pesticides, for example, in two different countries with different kinds of problems.
Sure, and it's always a question of taking the plus benefits and the minus and the net.
And
from this.
getting it. That's all
And
I'm
you see in
saying.
the case of DDT, you've got to remember what it did in malaria control worldwide. That's a pretty big plus. And it'll outweigh a lot of the minus. There's no good substitute, even up to this late time. In the case of DDT on many cotton insects, presently, there's no good active substitute. More people are killed right now, but good and fast, with the organic phosphates, especially in the developing countries, and certainly has happened with DDT. And they're killed fast. Maybe this is good, but I think it's a tragedy.
Not to change the subject, it's all part of the same subject package here, but we've talked about production, we've talked about the population control, about pesticides. There's another angle as a plant breeder, however, that concerns me in much of what's being done in countries where green revolutions are going on. When you bring in a new wheat variety that has the capabilities of responding to irrigation, to increase fertilizer, and so forth this way, of course, immediately it replaces to a very great extent and very rapidly the indigenous varieties that we have in these places. Now, over the period of time for the future, the plant breeders, you and I and plant pathologists who work in these areas, we're dependent entirely upon what we call germplasm banks. Now, these are simply reservoirs that are either being reproduced naturally, like the wild oat species are being reproduced in Israel at the present time in the deserts, or they may be very large collections which are perpetuated in storage, special storage conditions, as we have at the National Laboratory in Fort Collins, Colorado, or they may just be a series of collections which are grown sufficiently periodic to maintain the viability of the seed stocks. Now, when you move into an area like India and so on, or some other places, you certainly supplant many different genetic types. Now, This happened to us in the Corn Belt when the hybrid corn took over here so rapidly in the early 40s. And except for by the foresight at that time, and I might say lucky foresight, really, of some of the breeders in some of these states, all of the old corns were fed to the pigs up to the last ear. See? Once you had lost that reservoir of germplasm, that product of thousands and perhaps millions of years of evolution, those genes are lost forever, essentially. Now, what's being done on a worldwide basis? I know what's being done with my own crop, which happens to be the oat crop. What's being done internationally to try to preserve some of this for the future generations of plant breeders, if you like, as raw material with which to combat these diseases biologically that we know are going to change, to improve the quality of the grain, to meet the new fertilizer applications that are going to go on.
Fight
Well,
insects.
Fight insects.
I
across the
suppose
board.
in the case of wheat, the largest single collection viable seed in the world is in the U.S. Department of Agriculture store in Fort Collins.
It has
and
some
this is-
15 or 18,000.
It must have all of 18,000 at the present time. This is being added to gradually, but there's a committee representing various organizations to try to expand this in the foreseeable future, the next couple of years. Not only wheat itself, but related species of grasses, progenitors of the wheat species. And this, as you pointed out very well, Ken, needs to be done. And it needs to be done fast. Of course, India was really outside of the zone of origin of wheat. It's way out in the periphery. The areas where you need much more collection are in Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, as far as Israel, and then the secondary origin in the case of wheat in Ethiopia. And I rather doubt that there's adequate sampling. This is why this committee is supposed to make a recommendation. And I think it'll probably be funded in this next year or two.
Well,
collect
what's the possibility, Dr. Browning brought up an interesting point today when we were discussing this, what's the possibility of leaving this as a natural herbarium, so to speak? In other words, we have some natural prairies that we're protecting in Iowa because we want to sort of see what they were like. Now, we're not doing it for perpetuation of germplasm on the prairie at this point in time, but we're doing it so that our children and their children's children can see what the prairie was like back in the very early days, you see, before man invaded and took this all over and supplanted those first species. What about the natural herbaria? This is being done naturally with the oat species in Israel, but I don't know whether we
Well,
can
they-
afford this or...
Just another aspect of that population problem. Only in this case, it's both man and goats.
Yeah.
And, between them, why, there won't be any natural wild species in their zones of origin. Each time they're worked over more viciously, as there are more people and need for more
Man
goats.
chases the goats up the mountain a little farther each time.
So, in those densely populated areas that are already overgrazed, I don't think this is going to be the solution. There are many countries who have made local collections. They have poor facilities for storage. FAO has made one collection on durums that's stored in Turkey. And of course, one of the very large collections going back again to the late 20s and 30s was Vavilov's in Russia. Most of this collection presumably was lost when he no longer existed. Some of it remains.
I think the corn people, though, working the corn project with your CIMMYT, have made rather extensive collections, haven't they, in Latin America?
Oh yes, I think that there's a good representative collection of most of the unimproved mesas from Mexico South, including in the islands of the Caribbean.
Could I change the subject briefly? In your lecture tonight, you mentioned the prejudice of the Indian people against a red wheat, and they wanted a white wheat, and food prejudices generally. And it made me wonder about the situation in rice. I understand that this Philippine rice is still not very acceptable in the rice-eating areas of India. Is that true?
The original IR-8, this would be true. This is Japanese type sticky, gooey, kind you eat with chopsticks. instead of the dry cooking rices that are preferred in India and Southeast Asia. But many of the newer varieties that are coming out, like IR6 and 20, this is more of the Indian type as far as cooking quality is concerned. And you see, this is this sort of second echelon problem that's being corrected, maintaining the high yield of the original type that was widely distributed, and which is only adapted, incidentally, to areas where you have a lot of sunshine. You see, if you move IR8 into the dripping tropics, heavy summer rainfall or monsoon rains, there are a whole series of diseases that will decimate it. It's not adapted to those environments, but newer types are being developed, are already in commercial production, which take care of some areas where IR8 is not adapted. And this will be,
That's a bigger problem than the palatability, is it?
well, I would say the disease thing, of course, has to be corrected first when you go into these, and insect problems also, into these heavy rainfall areas. This is where you get into lots of trouble on diseases. And IR8 just can't go there from that standpoint, quite apart from the question of quality. But the quality thing, I think they're making good progress on this. And of course, you see, the institutes are never meant to be substitutes for the national breeding programs or research stations. They're simply to be additional help behind these, to try to build the strong national programs, whether it's in wheat or rice in India or any other crop, or in Pakistan and all of the countries. We try to build in technical know-how through trained people and feeding in materials, but they've got to carry the large amount of the responsibility, and we
Do you
help
have as
them
much
best
hope
we can.
for African crops?
I think that in the case of, well, it depends on where you are in Africa. You've got a whole system of situation of different surroundings, but we're making good progress.
In the south and
Along
west
the
and
North Rim in wheat, and it can be, and in the east. In the south, or in tropical Africa, I think that there'll be good progress in corn and sorghums, and in some areas where rice is eaten, there's good possibility there, but rice isn't, in most parts of Africa, preferred food. Corn and sorghum would be more to their liking and easier to expand.
Gentlemen, we will be back for the conclusion of tonight's program after this message.
We ever had.
And this is the last portion of our program, and as is not usually our practice with Dimension 5, usually we keep on talking until the wee small hours, but Dr. Borlaug has had a very hard day and has an early morning plane to catch. Where do you go? Now,
Going back to West Mexico, to Sonora, state of Sonora, tomorrow.
will you be out getting your hands dirty and
Hope so.
any of the fields? There were a number of questions that our viewers had, and I regret so much that we're not able to talk with you longer, but it has been a real pleasure having you as our guest tonight. Lorenzo, it's been marvelous to have you. And the other gentlemen I see more frequently on the Iowa State University campus, stalwarts all. And for our viewers, thank you very much for being with us. Join us again next week for Dimension 5.